The station smelled like recycled air and old fear. Cale Voss had learned to recognize that smell, the particular staleness of a place where people had been afraid for a long time. It clung to the vents at Relay Outpost Corda, the way cigarette smoke clings to old curtains, absorbed into the infrastructure itself. He stepped off the transit pod with one bag over his shoulder and a name he hadn't used in 4 years, Marcus Alden, Customs Tech, Grade 3 credential. A man with a history thin enough to pass through a scanner without catching on anything. He didn't look at the Vestry compliance officer posted at the gate. He had learned that too. Aliens could read eye contact the way humans read tone of voice. Something in the bioluminescent micro-expressions that pulsed at their temples, the way the light shifted when attention was focused. Looking directly at one was a declaration. Looking away was a confession. He had spent years cultivating the middle distance, the bland civic gaze of a man who had nowhere to be and nothing to hide. The officer's scanning rod passed over him once, then twice. Cale breathed through his nose. The rod moved on. Corda was a mid-tier relay station hanging in the upper atmosphere of a gas giant called Thurin 3. Its docking arms extended like the legs of something that had died gripping the sky. It had once been a human construction. The bones of it still were. The struts and transit corridors and service tunnels that ran beneath the habitation layer. But the Vestari had occupied it 43 years ago during the consolidation, and now their administrative architecture sat on top of the human infrastructure the way a new city grows on the ruins of an old one. You could still find the original markings if you knew where to look. Human measurements, human emergency designations. A handprint in polymer resin near Access Shaft 7, pressed there by someone who had been working when the first Vestari ships locked onto the docking arms and the alarms started sounding and the world went sideways. Cale knew because he had found the handprint himself 3 years ago. He knew Corda the way a man knows a place he grew up in, which was the point. He found the room Alara had arranged for him on Sublevel 4, a narrow slot in the habitation block that smelled of the same recycled air as the rest of the station, but had the added intimacy of mildew and someone else's cooking. A woman in the corridor watched him key in, not threatening, just watching. He gave her the blank civic gaze and she looked away. He set his bag down and sat on the bed. He allowed himself 30 seconds of stillness, a discipline he had learned not from training but from necessity. Those early months after the consolidation's second sweep, when he had spent 3 weeks in a maintenance crawl space on a colony ship and learned that panic consumed oxygen faster than calm. And then he opened his bag and took out the device that looked like a data tablet. It wasn't a data tablet. He keyed in the frequency and waited. Alara's voice came through without preamble. "You're late." The transit pod from Sector 11 was held at secondary screening. Someone's new narcotics protocol. "That's going to be a problem for the next run. I know. I'll find another route." He paused. "What's my position?" "Records office." The Vestari have been expanding their identity verification apparatus. They're cross-referencing biometric files from the consolidation's original surveys. Lot of records to process. They need humans who can interface with the old human format archives. You're one of 3 new technicians. Your supervisor is a Vestari mid-caste administrator named Corveth. A breath. Be careful with him. He's not ideological. He's procedural. Those are harder. And the other thing? A pause that had weight to it. 2 days ago, 2 Vestari enforcement agents boarded from a connecting vessel. They're not here for narcotics. Someone put a termination order on you, KL. Someone with enough resources to file it through the formal apparatus. He was quiet for a moment. Giran? Almost certainly. He has the political capital and the personal motive. Cale had met High Administrator Giran exactly once at a formal dinner during what had still been called the cooperative transition, the Vestari's delicate euphemism for the years immediately following consolidation, when collaboration was mandatory and resistance was framed as a neurological disorder. Giran had been mid-level then, not yet the regional administrator he'd become. He had said something at that dinner, something about the humans at the table and their provisional classification, and Cale's colleague Fatima had said something back, quiet and precise, and Giran's bioluminescence had pulsed out a color Cale had never seen before on a Vestari face. The dinner had ended shortly afterward. Fatima had died 2 months later. The official record called it an accident. "How long do I have?" Cale said. "Before they identify you? Hard to know. Your alias is clean. But they've flagged the records office for cross-reference searches. If they run your biometrics against consolidation files, Then I need to finish before they get there. Kale, I know. He pressed his thumb against the edge of the tablet, an old reflex. I'll be careful. He wasn't careful enough to believe that, and neither was she. But they both let it stand. The records office occupied a mid-level administrative block, a long room lined with server towers that housed the Consolidation-era archives. The ceiling was low by Vestari standards, but claustrophobically low by human ones, the result of a renovation that had added a secondary environmental layer above the original ceiling tiles. Kale had 3 meters of ceiling and the permanent sense that something heavy was balanced directly above his head. His workstation was in the second row. To his left, a human technician named Sarah who wore her hair pinned back and communicated in monosyllables. To his right, an empty station. Kale had been told it belonged to a technician named Davo who had taken medical leave. He did not ask follow-up questions about Davo. Corvith, his supervisor, was exactly what Alara had described. Methodical, impersonal, and more dangerous for it. The ideological Vestari hated humans with a heat that could be read and anticipated. Corvith didn't hate humans, he processed them. He moved through the office in the slow, measured way of an organism that had never needed to hurry because hurrying implied competition, and Corvith had never perceived himself to have competition. His bioluminescence ran at a steady pale amber, neutral administrative function. He reviewed Kale's credential file on intake and asked 2 precise questions and made a notation and moved on. The work itself was genuinely technical. The Vestari had been meticulous about the Consolidation archives. They were meticulous about everything. But the original human data formats were alien to them in precisely the reverse of the usual asymmetry, and the conversion process created errors that required human-readable interpretation. Kale processed files. He flagged inconsistencies. He noted format corruptions and submitted correction requests through the approved channels. In his second week, he found his mother's file. He hadn't expected to. He had known in the abstract that the records office housed Consolidation-era files, had known that the Consolidation Survey had documented virtually every human being in controlled space. But knowing it abstractly, and then sitting at a standard workstation, and encountering a file tagged with his mother's biometric identifier were different experiences in the way that knowing a war happened, and then finding a photograph are different. He kept his face still. He processed the file. He flagged a format error. There was one, genuinely, and submitted the correction request and moved on. That night, in his narrow room, he sat with what he remembered, which wasn't much. She had left when he was 5, or been taken, or both. The distinction was less clear than it should have been. He had a memory of her hands on a keyboard. He had a memory of being held. He had nothing after that, just the negative space where a person should have been, and a grandfather who didn't speak of her, and eventually a decision to stop asking. He had joined the resistance because he was angry about Fatima, but he had also been angry about other things for longer, and the anger had needed somewhere to go. He was still sitting there when his door chimed. He palmed the data tablet. Yes, it's Claudia. He opened the door. She was one of the station's longer-term residents, a human who had been on Corda for 6 years, officially employed as a ventilation maintenance specialist, unofficially part of the network that Alara ran. She was compact and watchful, and she had the eyes of someone who had been watching exits for a long time. "You have a problem," she said, stepping inside without being invited. He liked her for that. People who asked permission were people who expected it to be denied. Which problem? The 2 enforcement agents. They've been asking about the records office specifically, not about you. They don't have your alias yet, but they're pulling transit records from the past 6 months, looking for cross-matches against Consolidation biometric files. She paused. The kind of cross-match that would flag a certain person who was documented in a certain survey under a certain name. How long? 2 days. Maybe 3 if Corvith's paperwork is slow, and Corvith's paperwork is never slow. Kale looked at the middle distance for a moment. Then, does the station still run the film archive on sublevel 2? Claudia blinked. It was not the question she had expected. The what? There's an entertainment archive. Old human media, pre-consolidation. The Vestari haven't repurposed it.
It's technically part of the cultural preservation protocols from the transition agreement.
He had found it on his first time at Corda 3 years ago, and had spent an hour there that he had not reported to anyone. Sincher Novak runs it. He used to be a projectionist. Yes, Claudia said slowly. He does. Why does that matter? Because I need to make contact with the other element of the network. and I can't use the approved channel. And because I need somewhere to be for 2 hours that isn't my room or the records office." He picked up his jacket. "And because I haven't seen a film in 4 years." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she almost smiled, which was as close as she got. "You're strange," she said, "for someone with a termination order. I've been told, Senior." Novak was a small man who had been on Corda so long that he had the slightly compressed quality of someone who had adapted to low ceilings on a cellular level. He ran the archive from a room on sublevel 2 that was officially designated a cultural resource facility and unofficially designated a place where humans went to remember what they were. The projector was human-built, pre-consolidation, maintained by Novak with a devotion that bordered on the theological. He sourced the films from a distribution network that the Vestharis Cultural Preservation Office had approved and then immediately forgotten about. He didn't ask KL why he was there. He pointed at a chair and said, "You have 2 hours," and dimmed the lights. The film was an old thriller, something from before KL's time. A man on the run in a city that was beautiful and dangerous, and full of people, minding their own carefully maintained business. KL watched it in the way he watched things now, with the technical attention that had become his habit, cataloging exits and angles of approach, and the small behavioral tells that indicated a character knew they were being followed. But somewhere in the second act, when the protagonist sat alone in a room and let his face do something it hadn't done for the duration of the film, KL felt something loosen in his chest. He sat with it. After the film, Novak brought him tea without being asked. They sat in the dark of the projection room, and KL looked at the blank screen. "My father used to bring me to a place like this," KL said. He didn't know why he said it. Novak was quiet for a moment. "Where? Colony Station. Different life." He turned the cup in his hands. He was a technician. He used to say the old films were a form of documentation, that they recorded what people cared about before everything changed. Novak looked at the projector. He wasn't wrong. They sat in silence for another moment, and it was a comfortable silence, the kind you can only have with someone who has also learned to be comfortable with silence. Then Kale said, "I need to speak with Elza." Novak's expression didn't change. He took a slow sip of his tea. "That's not a name I know," he said. "I understand." Kale set down his cup. "Tell her Marcus Alden needs the package expedited. Tell her the window is 48 hours. Novak looked at the blank screen for a long time. "Finish your tea," he said finally. The next morning, Kale arrived at the records office to find a Vesthari enforcement agent standing at the end of his row. Not his row, the next one. Reviewing a file with Corveth, but standing at an angle that covered the room in the way that enforcement agents stood when they were reviewing a room rather than a file. Kale sat down. He opened his workstation. He began processing files. The agent's name, he learned it from a fragment of conversation between Corveth and another administrator. Not by asking, never by asking, was Dravith. The other agent, who was stationed near the corridor entrance, was apparently called by a designation KL's translation implant couldn't fully render, something with a tonal component that human vocal anatomy couldn't reproduce. He thought of them as Dravith and the other one, and he began mapping their movement patterns with the methodical attention he had developed for such things. Dravith was smart. That was the problem. The ideological agents were easier to read because their contempt made them sloppy. They saw what they expected to see, which was a human who was either compliant or dangerously not, and they sorted accordingly. Dravith looked at everything the same way. He moved through the records office with the same measured attention Corveth gave to paperwork. He was not looking for someone guilty. He was looking for something inconsistent. Kale processed files. He kept his biometric authenticator positioned at a slight angle, which Alara had shown him reduced the scanner's red range by approximately 12%. He kept his breathing even. He did not look at Dravith directly. He looked at the middle distance, the bland civic gaze. At the midday break, he went to the common area and ate something reconstituted that tasted approximately of protein, and sat near the window that looked out at Thurin III's cloud bands, immense and amber-colored and indifferent to everything happening inside the station's pressurized skin. He had always found something settling about looking at a gas giant. The scale of it was clarifying. Human problems, even significant ones, had a way of becoming appropriately sized. Sarah sat down across from him without comment. They ate in silence for a moment. "Dravith pulled Davos' file this morning," she said, not looking at him. "I figured. He'll be cross-referencing against incoming transit records by tomorrow. I know. She was quiet for a moment. There's a ventilation access point on sublevel 3 that connects to the old human service corridor. It runs the length of the station. If you needed to move without being tracked by the ceiling sensors, I know about the corridor. He looked at the cloud bands. How long have you been with the network? She didn't answer directly. She said, long enough to know that Davo was careful too. He took that the way it was meant. The package arrived through Novak that evening. A data chip the size of a fingernail, coded in a format that the Vestari's monitoring systems would read as a standard cultural archive transfer. Inside it was a complete set of forged transit documentation, a new biometric overlay that would read clean on a scanner, and a voice message from Alara that was 11 seconds long and said, essentially, the extraction point is ready, and you should leave, and there is no shame in leaving. Kale listened to it twice. He thought about the file with his mother's biometric identifier, sitting in the Vestari archive, flagged for a format error he had submitted for correction. He thought about the handprint near access shaft 7. He thought about Fatima saying something quiet and precise at a dinner table, and the way Giron's bioluminescence had shifted to a color that had no human translation. He thought about his son. The thought arrived, as it always did, without warning. 3 years old when Kale had last seen him, left with Kale's in-laws on a colony station in Sector 9. Old enough now to have memories that were entirely his own, memories that did not include his father. Kale had made a decision 4 years ago that the work was more important than his presence, and he had been right about the work, and he had been right to make the decision, and he had been wrong in ways that didn't make the decision less right, but didn't make it not wrong either. He was a man who had left. He was a man who kept finding reasons to leave. He was a man who had learned to believe the reasons were good ones, and he suspected they were, and he suspected that suspension was the crack in him that everything else had grown through. He put the data chip in his pocket. He did not pack his bag. In the morning, he went to the records office. Drevith was there again. The other one was not, had apparently been reassigned to the docking level, which meant the search was converging. Kale sat down and opened his workstation and processed files, and at approximately the second hour of the shift, he made a decision that he had been making and unmaking for 3 days, and made it for the last time. He began pulling files, not quickly. The records office handled hundreds of file requests per shift, and Kale was a technician who processed files, and he pulled files the way a technician processed files, methodically and without urgency. But the files he pulled were specific, communications records from the period immediately following the consolidation, flagged under a particular administrative designation that the Vestari's own bureaucracy had classified, and then, in the way of bureaucracies everywhere, filed and forgotten. The files documented the early resistance networks, names, locations, methods, the complete record of who had organized and how they had organized, and, this was the part that mattered, who had informed. The names of the humans who had cooperated with the Vestari's post-consolidation security apparatus, who had provided names in exchange for classifications and quiet lives. Giron's name was not in these files. That was not what Kale was looking for. What he was looking for was the evidence of what Giron had done after the consolidation. In the years when he had been building his administrative career on the rubble of the resistance networks that those informants had helped dismantle. The authorizations, the specific directives, the formal record of decisions that had been made about people, human people, named people, people like Fatima, that Giron had made personally and then buried under 3 layers of bureaucratic indirection. It took him 40 minutes to find it. It was in a subdirectory of an administrative archive, cataloged under a designation that translated approximately to Population Adjustment Coordination. The files were dry and technical and precise, which was the Vestari way, and they documented with meticulous care the decisions that had been made about specific humans during the transition period, the reasoning applied, the outcome assessed. Giron was listed as the originating authority on 47 separate entries. Fatima's name was on the list. Kale stared at it for a moment. He had known. He had been almost certain for 4 years. But knowing and seeing are different. He transferred the files to the chip. Technician Alden. He closed the workstation screen in the same motion, a smooth and unremarkable motion, the motion of a man reaching the end of a task, and looked up. Corvith stood at the end of his row. Kale looked at him with the bland, civic gaze. Your biometric authentication showed an anomaly on this morning's scan, Corvith said. He held a data pad in what passed for his primary manipulator. His bioluminescence was amber, steady, procedural. I've been asked to request a rescan at the administrative office. Behind Corvoth, at the far end of the room, Kale could see Dravith standing still in the way of someone who was pretending not to be paying attention, and was very much paying attention. Kale stood up, he said. Of course, he followed Corvoth toward the corridor. They walked at the steady pace of administrative procedure, through the records office, past the server towers, through the door into the corridor. Corvoth walked slightly ahead, the precise distance of a supervisor escorting a technician, not the distance of a captor escorting a prisoner. Kale watched the ceiling sensors. He knew this corridor. He had walked it every day for 3 weeks. He knew where the sensor coverage had a gap, a 6-meter stretch near the secondary junction, where a maintenance request had been pending for, according to the records he had accessed in his second week, 9 months. The Vesthari's administrative efficiency was extraordinary in some directions and negligible in others, and their facility maintenance followed a priority queue that put cosmetic and security repairs above environmental and sensor issues. He knew the gap was there. When he reached it, he turned left instead of following Corvoth right. He heard Corvoth make a sound that his translation implant rendered as a procedural alert, the verbal equivalent of a notation being made. He heard, a moment later, the sound of a communication being placed. He ran. The old human service corridor was exactly as Sarah had described it. A long, unlit tube running below the administrative level, accessible through the ventilation point on sub-level 3. Kale had been inside it twice before, once on his first visit to Corda, once to check the route for exactly this contingency. He ran through it now with the tablet pressed to his chest, not for the data. The data was on the chip. The chip was in his pocket, but because it was the one piece of equipment that could reach Alara in the next 4 minutes. He keyed the frequency as he ran. I have it, he said. I need the extraction now. A pause. Then Alara, docking arm 7. 15 minutes. I may have less than that. Then you'll have to be fast. He ran. The corridor was human-scaled in a way the rest of the station wasn't, and he felt it. Felt the difference in the ceiling height and the proportions of the walls, the way the space fit him, the way a tool fits a hand. Whoever had built this place had built it for people like him, people of this height, and this anatomy, and this specific range of movement, and the thought arrived with an odd and inappropriate warmth. This part of the station still belongs to us. He came out on sub-level 2, 30 meters from the docking arms, and found the corridor occupied, not by Vesthari, by a human. A man, older, broad through the shoulders, wearing the coat of a maintenance worker. He was standing with the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting a long time and has learned not to look like it. Kale stopped. The man looked at him. He had the eyes of someone who had made a choice a long time ago and had been living in the consequences of it since. Not a bad man, necessarily. Just a man who had made a choice. Kale had met many of them. Vilmar, the man said, not introducing himself, identifying Kale, which meant he had been given Kale's alias. Kale had enough time to register this and to understand its implications, that someone in the network had talked, or that the termination order had broader reach than Alara had believed, or both, before Vilmar moved. He was fast, for a man of his age and size. He moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this kind of work before, and didn't enjoy it, but was competent at it. He came at Cole's right side, which was the dominant side for most humans, which was not Cole's dominant side. Cole stepped left instead of right. It was a small mistake for Vilmar to assume. But Kale had spent 4 years collecting other people's small mistakes. He caught Vilmar's primary arm, redirected the momentum, and put him against the wall with more force than was strictly necessary. Vilmar hit the wall hard and went down. Not unconscious, hurt. Kale looked at him for a moment. Who sent you? He said. Vilmar looked up at him with pain in his face and something else. Something that might have been relief at still being alive, and something that might have been shame. Man from Sao Paulo, he said, which was the old slang for off-world administrative class. Paid good. He paused. Didn't say you'd be. He stopped. Didn't say what? Vilmar looked at the floor. Didn't say you'd be a person, he said. The way he talked about you, I thought you'd be something different. Kale stood still for a moment. He took the identification chip from his secondary pocket, the clean one, the one he'd been planning to use for extraction, and set it on the floor next to Vilmar's hand. That'll get you out of Corda, he said. Sector 9 route. Don't use it if you're going to keep working for people like him. He left Vilmar there and ran for the docking arm. Docking Arm 7 smelled of hydraulic fluid and departure, the specific combination of machine oils and pressurized seals that Kale associated with every transit he had ever made. The extraction vessel was a standard maintenance shuttle, which meant it was below the threshold of routine scanning, which was exactly why Elara used them. Claudia was already there at the access hatch, her hands moving with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. She looked at him. "You're bleeding." He was. He hadn't noticed. "Sub-level 2 altercation. Do I want to know? Probably not." He handed her the data chip. "This goes to Elara directly. Not through any of the standard channels. Giran has reach into at least one node of the network. Someone gave my alias to a contact for hire." Claudia took the chip and looked at it. "What's on it?" "Everything. 47 entries, originating authority on each one." He paused. "The formal record. The kind that can be published, verified, cross-referenced against the Vestari's own administrative archive. The kind they can't deny." She was quiet for a moment. "He'll know it was you. He knows it was me already. That's why the termination order exists." "Kale, I know." He looked at the hatch. "I know." They boarded the shuttle in silence. The hatch sealed behind them. Through the small port, Kale watched the docking arm retract, watched the station fall away, watched Thurin III's cloud bands fill the viewport, vast and amber and indifferent, the same as always. He thought about his son. He thought about a file in a Vestari archive, correctly cataloged now, format error resolved, carrying his mother's name in clean data. He thought about Fatima and the words she had said at a dinner table, quiet and precise, the last act of defiance of a woman who had known exactly what she was doing. The words had not saved her. They had been heard. Eventually, by someone, they had been heard, and here was where they had arrived. A maintenance shuttle leaving a relay station with a data chip that contained the proof. He thought about the son he had left behind, and the son who had left him, and the man who sat between those two facts and tried to live there. The extraction run was 6 hours to the transfer point. Claudia slept, or pretended to. Kale sat and watched the stars. 3 months later, in a corridor on a colony station in Sector 9, Kale waited outside a room where a woman named Flavia was interviewing a doctor about his father. He had not announced himself. He had arrived quietly, the way he arrived everywhere, and found a wall to stand near, and waited. The doctor's name was Tomas. He was 31 years old. He had his father's face in the way that children have their parents' faces. Not an exact copy, but an echo. The same angles rearranged into someone new. He was speaking with precision and care and a kind of deliberate steadiness that Kale recognized as the quality of a person who had been asked this question before and had decided a long time ago how he was going to answer it. "I don't have any memories of him," Tomas was saying. "Not a single one, but I know what he did." Flavia said something Kale couldn't hear. "That's the thing," Tomas said. His voice was level. "He wasn't there, and he did it anyway. He did it from somewhere I couldn't reach him, and I used to think that was the worst part." He paused. "I don't think that anymore." Kale leaned against the wall. He had been carrying the chip for 3 months, and the data on it had been published and verified, and had begun the slow, grinding work of international documentation and formal accusation. That was the only kind of justice that actually worked. Giran had been suspended from his administrative post pending review. The 47 entries had been broadcast through every human-accessible channel in the network. The Vestari's own procedural apparatus, which Corveth would have recognized, was moving through its paces. It would take years. It would be incomplete. It would be contested and obstructed, and slowly, painfully, partially successful. That was what humans did with things like this. They kept pushing. They survived the incomplete and the partial and the painfully slow, and they pushed because the alternative was to stop, and the alternative was not something they were constitutionally capable of. Kale had thought about this on the shuttle and on every transit since. He had thought about what made humans specifically human in the way that the Vestari apparently could not understand and apparently could not anticipate. Not the defiance, because the Vestari had met defiance before from other species and had methods for it. Not the stubbornness, which was just defiance extended across time. What they couldn't account for was the record. Humans documented. They wrote things down. They built archives and maintained them with the devotion that Novak maintained his projector. And they passed the documentation through networks and into the hands of the next person and the person after that, so that the things that had happened could not be made not to have happened just because the people who had experienced them were gone or silenced or afraid. The 47 entries had existed in Garan's archive because the Vesthri documented too, but they documented for administrative efficiency, for the clean functioning of systems. Kale had taken that documentation and passed it to Alara, and she had passed it to Flavia, and Flavia had passed it to the formal record. And now it existed in a different archive, a human one that was organized not around efficiency but around memory. That was the thing the Vesthari couldn't compute. That a species would maintain a record not because it was useful, but because forgetting was not something they were willing to do. The interview was ending. He could hear the shift in tone, the sound of chairs moving. He pushed off the wall. He walked to the corner of the corridor and stood there, within sight of the door, and he waited. Tomas came out of the room first. He stopped when he saw Kale. He looked at him for a long moment with a face that was an echo of a face Kale knew very well, rearranged into someone who had grown up without him. There were things in that look that Kale had been preparing for and things he hadn't been preparing for, and the balance of them was not what he had expected. He had expected more anger. He had expected the anger to be harder. "You're late," Tomas said. There was a long silence. "I know," Kale said. Tomas looked at him with his father's eyes, older than they should have been, patient in the way of someone who has been waiting long enough that patience is no longer an effort. "Okay," he said. "Come inside." Kale had learned a long time ago not to let his face do things that would compromise a position. He had practiced and maintained and disciplined that lesson for 4 years. He let it go now. He followed his son inside.